Welcome to today's American Community Media Weekly National Briefing. I'm Sunita Sarabji, your moderator today and co-producer of our weekly Friday briefings with my colleague Pilar Marrero. On July 4th, Independence Day, President Donald Trump signed into law a sweeping bill that affirms much of his agenda, keeping in place tax cuts imposed during his first term, giving the fossil fuel industries and border security a big budget boost, and sharply narrowing the scope of health and food safety nets, including Medicaid and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program known as SNAP. Speakers today will discuss some of the impacts of the new budget and spending bill, including long-term effects on American health, the environment, and the national deficit, which is expected to rise by $3 trillion over the next decade. Our speakers today are Larry Levitt, Executive Vice President for Health Policy at KFF, Bill McKibben, writer, environmentalist, and founder of Third Act, which organizes older adults to act on climate change, Natasha Sarin, professor at the Yale Law School and Yale School of Management, and Richard Prisenzano, Director of Policy Analysis at the Budget Lab at Yale. Richard will not be presenting, but will take questions during the Q&A. We asked reporters to enter questions in the chat, and we will then proceed to Q&A immediately after each speaker presents. Later this afternoon, we will send a video along with expanded bios. So we've got a 987-page bill to unpack in 57 minutes, so let's get right to it. Our first speaker today is Larry Levitt, who will examine the impact of the $900 billion cut to Medicaid, the largest ever cut in the program's history. Welcome, Larry.
Thanks, Anita. So this bill was not framed as a healthcare reform effort. It was framed more as a tax cut bill, but it represents the biggest change to the healthcare system since the passage of the Affordable Care Act 15 years ago. And in its effect, it amounts to what is effectively a partial repeal of the ACA, erasing much of its gains in health coverage. The Congressional Budget Office has estimated that the legislation would reduce federal health spending by over $1 trillion over the next decade and increase the number of people uninsured by 11.8 million. Those are preliminary numbers and will likely come down somewhat given the last-minute changes to the bill. Still, the scale of the change to the healthcare system is staggering. This represents the biggest rollback in federal support for health coverage ever. But the law is complicated, and a few of the provisions are direct cuts in Medicaid or ACA benefits or eligibility, though they would have that effect indirectly. In Medicaid, the provision that generates the most savings to the federal government is a new work requirement that applies to adults made eligible for the ACA Medicaid expansion. But the vast majority of these adults, about 9 in 10, are either working or would qualify for an exemption from the work requirement. But 4.8 million people are expected to lose health coverage, primarily because they fail to navigate the reporting process and the red tape that would be required. Some people would also fall through the cracks because they will be required to renew their Medicaid coverage more frequently, every 6 months rather than once a year. And regulations issued by the Biden administration would be stopped by this bill. These include measures to make enrollment easier and beef up staffing in nursing homes. Enrollees with income above the poverty level, about $16,000 for a single person, would be required to have new copays, potentially as high as $35 at the option of states. There are also restrictions on taxes paid by healthcare providers, which help states finance their share of Medicaid spending. That could force states to cut payments to hospitals and other healthcare providers or to other parts of the Medicaid program. One of the big concerns during the debate in the Senate was the effect on rural hospitals. And in fact, a substantial share of the cuts were directed at rural areas, and rural hospitals in particular have low margins and are potentially more vulnerable to closing or cutting off services as a result of the cuts. A temporary $50 billion rural health fund was added. That will certainly help in rural communities, but it won't fully compensate for the cuts, especially since the fund is temporary and the cuts are permanent. The changes to the healthcare marketplace, the ACA marketplace, have gotten less attention to the changes in Medicaid, but they are also substantial. New verification procedures for income would make it harder for people to sign up for coverage, and these new procedures would effectively end automatic renewal of coverage at the end of each year, which could lead to many people having their coverage canceled. There would no longer be any caps on how much people have to repay for subsidies or tax credits to help them pay their premiums when they file their taxes the following year if their income ends up higher than expected, and that could lead to nasty surprises for people and discourage them from signing up to begin with. Importantly, many low-income, lawfully present immigrants would no longer be eligible for premium assistance under the Affordable Care Act. That would also be the case in Medicaid and Medicare. These are not undocumented immigrants who have never been eligible for any federally funded health insurance benefits. These are lawfully present immigrants who fall into categories such as temporary protected status, refugees, or asylees. There was a provision in the bill passed by the House that would have penalized states with less Medicaid funding if they used their own money to provide health care to undocumented immigrants. That provision didn't make it into the final legislation because it didn't comply with Senate budget rules. But some states, including California, that have provided this coverage to undocumented immigrants have proposed scaling back, and there are potentially efforts underway by the Trump administration to penalize those states as well. There are other provisions that have flown more under the radar, an expansion of health savings accounts, for example, and a one-year cutoff of funding to Planned Parenthood. And because the legislation increases the budget deficit by so much, as Sunita said, it would trigger automatic spending cuts in Medicare, totaling about $500 billion. In the past, these automatic cuts have been waived by Congress, but there's no guarantee that will happen again this year. One of the biggest looming changes in healthcare is one that frankly was never even part of the bill or the discussion, and that is enhanced premium tax credits under the Affordable Care Act that were passed in 2021 by the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress. Those tax credits are slated to expire at the end of this year. If they're not extended, out-of-pocket premiums for ACA enrollees, and that's over 20 million enrollees, will rise by an average of more than 75%, and millions are projected to end up uninsured. That will happen New Year's Day 2026 if these tax credits are not extended. Now, Republicans have framed the changes in Medicaid as eliminating fraud, waste, and abuse. Healthcare fraud is certainly an issue, but it is primarily perpetrated by rogue healthcare providers, and there's nothing in this bill that addresses that kind of fraud. Waste and abuse is to some extent in the eyes of the beholder, but the scale of the cuts in this bill go well beyond any definition of fraud, waste, and abuse. As substantial as the changes in the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill are, they won't all happen immediately. In fact, many of the changes are backloaded, timed after the midterm elections next year and beyond. We're not all going to wake up one morning and find millions more people uninsured. The changes to Medicaid and the ACA are going to roll out bit by bit over the next decade. But again, the scale of the changes that will take place over the next decade are truly staggering. And even before much of this legislation goes into effect, you can bet we're going to be hearing a lot about it between now and next November's election. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Larry. Lilia Galindo from Cafe Con Leche, a radio program in Riverside, California, has the first question. Lilia, could you please ask your question of Larry?
Hi. I just want to ask you, can a new Congress undo everything that was passed in the last big, beautiful bill?
Yeah, I mean, certainly these are legal changes that could be undone, delayed, or changed by a future Congress. I think one challenge is in this bill, Republicans made these changes, particularly the tax cuts, that will increase budget deficits substantially. In the past, Democrats have generally not been willing to do that, have insisted on paying for any changes. Obviously, reversing these cuts would cost money, so a question would be, where the money would come from in order to do that. But certainly, a future Congress could change or delay these things, and the fact that so many don't take place for many years. I am sure there will be a lobbying effort, particularly by hospitals, to delay the effects that would affect their payments.
And Lilia, you had a second question about the hit to Hispanic immigrants. Would you go ahead and ask that question?
Sure. How will this big, beautiful bill will impact Hispanic immigrants, both those who are undocumented and those who are here legally, as well as low-income immigrant communities?
Yeah, so there's nothing in the bill that directly affects undocumented immigrants, but the bill includes a number of measures that would shift costs to states, and those states that have used their own money to provide health care to undocumented immigrants may find themselves under pressure to cut health coverage they have provided to undocumented immigrants, and we're already seeing that happening in some states, including California. There are a whole range of measures in this bill that would limit Medicaid, Affordable Care Act, and Medicare coverage to lawfully present immigrants. And I'll give a couple examples. Um, uh, Lawfully present immigrants generally have to wait 5 years before they qualify for Medicaid. During that 5-year period, they are still eligible for Affordable Care Act coverage, even if their incomes are below poverty, and the poverty level is generally the threshold for qualifying for those premium tax credits. Many of those categories of immigrants would no longer be eligible. Generally speaking, eligibility in these programs would be limited to green card holders going forward. So a really big change in eligibility for health coverage for immigrants.
Absolutely. Orhan Kurt has the next question. Orhan, welcome. Could you please ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Sunita. So my question is, so many people will lose their insurance, healthcare program, Medicaid, etc. So how they will get the healthcare services? So I don't know, maybe many licensed, unlicensed doctor will be on the field, and it might affect the community. I am just curious. Everyone is not able to go to the hospital or the private doctor to get treatment. So what do you think? How those people will get healthcare services?
Yeah, well, I think that the reality is with so many people, estimates of 12 million losing health insurance coverage, some people simply will not get access to health care as a result of the changes in this bill. I think it'll put a lot of pressure on the healthcare safety net, on community health centers, on public clinics and hospitals. But I think, particularly for immigrant communities, there's going to be a hesitation to use the healthcare system, which could threaten their status or the status of family members. And in fact, just this week, the Trump administration announced measures that would limit a broad range of safety net, including family planning clinics, community health centers, mental health clinics, and limiting the use of federal funds for coverage of undocumented immigrants. So I think, this bill will cut off access to healthcare for a lot of people and have a chilling effect on people's access to the safety net.
Pilar Marrero has the next question. Pilar.
Hi, I wonder if there are any numbers or calculations beyond the number of newly uninsured people that this will provoke of the impact on the health of the nation, meaning, increasing mortality, uh, diseases, etc. Is there anything like that?
Yeah, there have been a few recent estimates, for example, of how this increase in the number of people without health insurance would increase mortality. Don't have those numbers offhand, but happy to get them to you. But there's clear evidence that providing people with health insurance, providing people with access to healthcare, reduces premature death. But it goes beyond simply mortality. It's also access to primary and preventive care, which will lead to poor health down the road. And there are broader implications for the healthcare system. If a rural hospital closes because of these Medicaid cuts, that means reduced access, not just for Medicaid or ACA enrollees, but reduced access for the whole community.
Thank you. The next question comes from Gabriel Young. Gabriel, could you please ask your question?
Hi, thank you so much, Larry, for being here. Here for the California Commission on API Affairs, we're curious if there's any data on the different racial ethnic impacts for the major groups in the US. I know earlier you mentioned for undocumented Hispanic immigrants, but just curious broad for the Black community, the AAPI community, and others, if you have any data on that.
Yeah, no estimates yet, but I mean, certainly these programs, Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act, disproportionately benefit communities of color. So there's no doubt there will be a disparate impact. And I would say it's subtler, but if you look at something like the work requirement, which where the estimates show that upwards of 5 million people would lose health insurance. Not because they're not working or they wouldn't qualify for an exemption, let's say because they're ill or they have caregiving needs, but just because they would fail to navigate the red tape. States would be permitted to require people to verify their work or verify their exemption as often as every month. And the experience when this happened in Arkansas and Georgia is that people simply fell through the cracks. And that's going to be more likely for people who have less education, who for whom English is not a first language. Navigating that red tape is going to be more difficult.
Larry, there's so many more questions for you in the chat, but I wanted to ask one question myself. Residents of Bakersfield, California are one of the largest consumers of Medicaid. Over 60% in that region use it. Do you expect the one rural hospital in that region to immediately shut down?
I would not expect hospitals to immediately shut down. We have already seen a clinic in Nebraska that shut down and blamed this bill. I think similar to what happened after the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare passed, anything bad that happened in the healthcare system got blamed on Obamacare. I think the same thing will happen here. Anything bad that happens in healthcare will get blamed on the so-called one big beautiful bill. In many cases, that'll be true. In some cases, it won't. But the cuts are so backloaded. I think it'll take a number of years to see the effects on rural healthcare access and hospital closure. But hospitals are going to be looking down the road, and if they're on the edge of being able to make a go of it, and they see cuts coming in the years ahead, that could certainly accelerate closures.
Yeah, and I believe KFF News put out an analysis saying that about 300 rural hospitals are in fact on the edge. Is that right?
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not that this bill won't affect urban hospitals as well. It certainly will. It's just that urban hospitals tend to be financially in financially better shape than rural hospitals.
Well, thank you so much. And if you could answer some of the questions directed at you in the chat, that would be terrific. And
Sure.
please stay around for a final round of questions.
Happy
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we now move on to Natasha Sarin, who will discuss the budget implications of the bill, including the impact to the federal deficit. The Yale Budget Lab has also provided us with their analysis, and I will drop the link in the chat. Reporters, please keep your questions coming. Welcome, Natasha.
Thanks so much, Sunita. And maybe I'll actually start with Pilar's question on Medicaid, because this is a place where I have done a bit of work thinking through some of the estimates from economists who have studied the relationship between health insurance coverage and health outcomes. And it's kind of the relationship is pretty intuitive, as Larry was describing. Like, if you have vulnerable populations, particularly the elderly or the ill, who have access to health insurance, they're going to have a higher likelihood of going to the hospital, a higher likelihood of early stage treatment for diseases like cancer and diabetes. And the Affordable Care Act actually gave economists the capacity to study what an expansion of health insurance means for outcomes like mortality. And their estimates, like those of economists Bruce Meyer and Angela Weiss, which said that those Medicaid expansions under the ACA, they saved the lives of about 28,000 people over the course of a 10-year span. If you take what has been done in the reconciliation package, which is CBO estimates about 11 million people are going to lose health insurance coverage just from the bill over the course of the next decade. And then you add on, as Larry was describing, the impact of the potential expiration or likely expiration of the premium tax credits at the end of this year. That's closer to 16 million people who are going to lose health insurance. In aggregate, if you take what economists have done who have studied this question and say, how many more preventable deaths are we going to have over the course of the next 10 years as a result of this package? The answer is over 100,000 and likely closer to 200,000. So it is a very, very significant impact. And it's a significant impact, particularly on those most vulnerable populations who are the most likely to lose coverage. I want to turn a bit to some of I promised Anita we would do some of the sort of broad fiscal impacts of this bill, and then also some of the particular provisions that might be most interesting or most relevant to members of this group. So big picture fiscal impacts. Today, the country's debts are approximately the same size of our entire economic output. So we have a debt to GDP ratio that's like close to 100%. If you take the bill that was just passed through Congress and those provisions and you say, let's take away the gimmicks of the provisions, there's a lot of sunsetting and, this tax cut only for this period of time. But in all likelihood, we expect legislators to try to return to make a lot of this permanent. Well, if you do all of that, what you're going to find is that by the end of this decade, that debt to GDP ratio is going to be closer to 135%. So our debts are going to exceed by a substantial margin our entire economic output. And roughly speaking, it's about a $3 trillion deficit increase if you take the bill as it stands. But if you do the extensions that are very likely to come, and the fact that all of the expirations are likely to get pushed out of this past 10-year budget window, then you're looking at something that's closer to $4 trillion plus over the course of the next 10 years. And it's important to ask yourselves, like, what exactly are those dollars being spent on? And this is work that I've done with Rich and my colleagues at the Yale Budget Lab, where we say distributionally, kind of you're spending $4 trillion, $3 trillion, $4 trillion, who are the winners and who are the losers of particular choices that legislators made in this package. And what you see is that the bottom 40% of the distribution, despite the fact that we spent $3 trillion plus dollars, is actually worse off after this bill than they were before the bill's passage. And the reason for that is that they are losing roughly $700 of income in the bottom decile in after-tax and transfer income, because they're the ones who are bearing the brunt of these cuts. They're the ones for whom the Medicaid cuts, the SNAP cuts are really hitting them very deeply. And that's way offsetting any potential impact of the tax changes that are in this bill. If you look instead at the top 1% of the distribution, so the very wealthiest people in the economy, those people are getting a huge tax cut, a tax cut of about $30,000 annually as a result of this package. And that number goes up as you go further and further up in the distribution. The top 0.1%, something like a few $100,000 of tax cuts for those individuals, because they're the ones who are most impacted by both the extension of the Trump tax cuts and particular provisions in this bill that provide them a greater share of the pie. The bill to try to scale, I often think that these numbers, the like 4 trillion and the 135% debt to GDP ratio are a little bit hard to make tangible. And so to try to try to give you two different ways I think it's helpful to understand them. One is that if you look at this bill and you assume that its provisions are made permanent, the bill is as big as the entirety of the federal government's response to COVID, so the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan, and then also the big legislative pieces of the Biden administration, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and the CHIPS Act. So like all of those things together are the same size as this bill. This bill is very, very large. Another way to understand, like, in some sense, like what these deficit numbers mean or why they matter is that running higher deficits is going to increase the government's cost of borrowing, right? So it's going to make it, in order to finance that debt, we're going to need to sell more of it. People are going to demand higher prices for it. And so we are going to have higher interest rates. We, the government, are going to have higher interest rates than we would in the absence of this deficit financed package. But those higher interest rates actually trickle down to households and the real economy in meaningful ways, because that higher interest rate isn't just for the government. It's also that mortgage rates are going to be thousands of dollars higher. Mortgage costs are going to be thousands of dollars higher because mortgage rates are going to be higher for households. It means that small business loans are going to be more expensive for households by, on average, thousands of dollars over the course of the next decade. Car loans, student loans, basically any type of borrowing that's being done in the economy has been impacted by this legislation and pushed up. The cost of it has been pushed up from the perspective of both households and from the perspective of businesses. And that's why the package in the long run, over the course of the next decade, and even more so over the course of the next 3 decades, actually leads to a smaller economy, because we lose GDP from this package because we're losing economic output from the fact that we're making it more costly to do things like invest in the US. And again, it's important to take into account what's being done, I feel like, in the economic policies of this administration writ large, rather than looking at just this bill in isolation. Because something that we heard during the debate around the bill is that, in fact, what was being done is, sure, if you look at the scores from scorekeepers, there's a deficit impact, but the deficit impact is actually the debt is in some sense being paid for by the administration's trade policy, by the fact they're have all these tariffs on countries and that they're collecting revenue from those higher tariffs. And there's a couple of points that are important here to grasp. One is that the tariffs, even as they stand today, like we at the Budget Lab have been lifetime updating the impacts of the tariffs, and they're moving around a lot. But as of today, effective tariff rates are quite high. I mean, they're about 18.7%. To give you some context, they started in this administration closer to 2%. So it's a very big jump. As a result of these tariffs, you're going to raise about $2.5 trillion over the course of the next decade. So even the tariffs, if they stay in place at the very high rates that they are at today, or will be at on August 1st, once this pause expires, you are not offsetting the cost of this bill. But another piece that's important is that, like the tax bill, it's important to see like where the tariffs are being paid. And it turns out that tariffs are most important to households that consume a lot of their income, because they're the ones that are going to feel the impact of higher prices in the economy most. And so in some sense, if you take the bill that was passed last week and this administration's trade policy, it's like a double whammy on American consumers at the bottom of the distribution, because they're the ones who bear the brunt of the Medicaid cuts, and they're the ones for whom the fact that prices are going to go up in the American economy by somewhere around $2,500 annually for the American household, that hits them the hardest. And so this is like regressive economic policy because in some sense, or I've called it like reverse Robin Hood economic policy, because we are taking from the bottom of the distribution and giving to the top of the distribution. There's a couple of provisions in here that are kind of new from a tax policy perspective and have gotten some attention. And so I just want to spend like 1 second to wrap talking a little bit about some of the new no tax on policies, which were part of the president's campaign promises that in some form have been legislated as a result of this bill. So one piece of it is there is a no tax on tips / no tax on overtime provision. It's actually not like, you might say like, okay, that means I don't pay tax on my tips or I don't pay tax on overtime. That's actually not what it means. It means that you can deduct up to $25,000 of taxes that you would have had to pay on tips or overtime income. But on overtime, it's actually $12,500. So $25,000 on tips and $12,500 on overtime. But you can only deduct up to a certain income threshold, and then you start being phased out of the credit. So it's people who are below I think it's about, Rich will correct me, but I think it's about $125,000 of income for individuals and $300,000 of income for joint filers, so people who are married and filing jointly. And importantly, for overtime specifically, the deduction limit only applies to the portion of your wages that are overtime income. So it's not the whole 1.5 times wages. It's just the piece of it that is the extra 50% that you are compensated for as overtime. And in both cases, there are sort of specifications on industries and jobs that are qualifying for these types of new no tax on provisions that aren't actually fully specified. So it's a bit like, workers who are in occupations that traditionally receive tips are eligible for the no tax on tips, but what those occupations precisely are, we haven't quite sketched out yet, and is for Treasury and the IRS to come up with regulations that lay out what those type of restrictions are likely to be. The last thing I want to say is that—
Sorry, can we go to a few questions from the chat? I'm so sorry.
Of course.
We're running a little bit out of time, and I just want to get to some of these questions before we move on. So Henrietta Burrows has a question for you. Henrietta, please go ahead with your question.
Thanks so much, Sunita. Natasha, when you consider all of the detrimental effects that the great, big, beautiful bill has, how then would you explain for those who support the bill how this bill will make America great again?
I think that's actually a really hard question, in that it won't make America great again by any metric that I can come up with. The only thing that I can offer you is that for a certain segment of the population, that is people who are very high earners, and particularly very high earners in certain types of industries, they are massively benefited by this package, and the rest of the population is massively hurt by the package. And I think that's just a reality, and one that hopefully now will make its way into the ether. It was sort of a struggle to try to communicate exactly who the winners and losers are of this bill, I think, while it was being legislated.
Yeah, let's bring in Richard for this next question from Elena Kuznetsova of Slavic Sac. Elena, please ask your question.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. So far, from what I hear about the bill, formally it aims to cut the budget deficit. But however, what again, I heard it works in the opposite way. So are there any chances, legal instruments to hold the politicians voted for this bill accountable, especially considering what you say, that we'll see the impact in decades? Just, I mean, should we wait or we can do something? Thank you.
Richard?
Yeah, this is a little bit out of my field. That sounds like a sort of a political science question. I think the thing that's right there is that this does increase deficits. It does not decrease the deficit. So if folks were running on that, they're wrong, and I think all the evidence points to that. I will say that I think one thing that the talking about the bill as it was coming up, there was sort of an trying to make the case that since we were just extending tax cuts, that they shouldn't cost anything. And so I think there was some talk that, you know, for extending what is called current law, that there shouldn't be a cost associated with it. And that I think is also wrong from just like an economic standpoint. I think no one would balance their checkbook that way, sort of assuming that they have a job if they don't at the end of the year. I don't think anyone would do that. So I think maybe that's where the question is coming from. But the bill certainly adds to the deficit. It goes against anyone that said it would not. And then I think they tried to make it look like it costs less by not associating a cost with things that are current law.
Excellent. Pilar Morera has a question. Could either of you take on Pilar's question? Pilar?
Well, I think Natasha partly answered the question, but I also refer to the Social Security, cutting taxes on Social Security, quote unquote. When the bill passed, immediately I received a press release saying, this is a great win for seniors. We're cutting taxes on Social Security. Turns out it's not accurate, but they are giving a tax credit for seniors. Can you explain how that works, Natasha or Richard?
Yeah, Rich, do you want to?
Yeah, so it is what it is it's an extra amount of money that is in a standard deduction. So everyone can sort of decide to itemize if you own a home, things like that. You might want to itemize your deductions if you have a lot of deductions. But one of the things that the Tax Cut and Jobs Act did, that this the big beautiful bill also did, is increase the standard deduction, so it's kept at an elevated level. So there's much fewer people that will actually itemize. They'll just take the standard deduction. Actually, kind of eases people's taxes in that way. And so for seniors, you can qualify and you actually get an additional amount that you get as a standard deduction. So there is a tax benefit to being a senior. I'm sure there are other benefits as I get closer to being a senior. But that is actually in the bill. I think some of this is messaging. I think the benefit is pretty small. And again, Natasha made point of it is like you can kind of look at the distributional analysis and you kind of look at these different cuts. And I don't think it's that big, but it is, hey, we did this. We said we were going to do this and we did it. And then I think you can argue about how big or small it is.
And it's way
I have a
small, I
follow-up.
should say, relative, Pilar, to repealing Social Security taxes altogether, which the bill does not do, would have cost $1.6 trillion over a decade. So this is like a very small step in the direction of a benefit for seniors, but it's nothing like no tax on Social Security.
And Natasha, sorry.
I forgot to mention that it is temporary. Natasha mentioned that there's some of these provisions are temporary. And these no tax on things are very, I think, strategically designed to end just as Trump's administration ends. And so clearly they're expecting to then sort of campaign on that in the future.
Yeah, Natasha, there's a question for you about defining who the very wealthy are. At what income do you become a very wealthy? And following up on that, who actually gets the benefit of the child tax credit? Lower income families seem not to be eligible for that credit. Is that right?
Yes, that's a super important point. And so the way that the expansion of the child tax credit was designed in this bill is it is an increase of the credit amount from $2,000 to $2,200. But importantly, the credit isn't refundable. And so what that means is the very lowest income Americans who pay little or no federal income tax, certainly not $2,000 or $2,200 of taxes, do not get the full benefit or any benefit potentially of the child tax credit because they do not have taxable income that makes them eligible for the credit. And so something that the Biden administration tried to push very hard for, but ultimately was not able to legislate, was full refundability for the child tax credit, which would have meant that those low income families were not left behind, but they have been by this expansion of the child tax credit. The who counts as the top is like an eternal question. And it's really sort of, again, a bit of like a messaging and communications question that is probably above my pay grade. But what I can tell you is we've done many different cuts of the top. So you can do the top 10% of the distribution. They're way better off than the bottom 90%. The top 1% is even better off than the top 10%. The top 0.1% is even better off, and the top 0.01% is even better off. So people who have incomes where they're making millions of dollars a year are the biggest winners of this package. And people who have incomes where they're close to or below the poverty line are the biggest losers of the package.
Thank you. Natasha and Richard, there are so many more questions for you in the chat. And
네,
we
지금
hope
약간
you will...
중단이 됐습니다. 이게 지금 죄송합니다. 네, 그래서 이제 지속하겠습니다. 계속해서 채팅하겠고요, 사람들이.
Hello? Sorry,
Okay,
I think we went to an interpreter channel.
okay.
But could you
Yeah,
please...
could you reassign the interpreter channel over here because there was a little cut off here. Sorry about that.
Jessica, could you please do that?
Yeah, I'll take care of that.
Thank you so much. Yes, Natasha and Richard, if you could please answer some additional questions for you in the chat, that would be terrific. Our final speaker today is Bill McKibben, who will discuss the environmental impacts of this bill. Welcome, Bill.
Well, thank you very much, and a pleasure to be with you. The environmental impacts of this bill are, of course, very large. I'm going to try and put them in some context. There are two important contexts to consider. One is the fact that the planet is now warming very rapidly, and we're seeing the effects around us on a regular basis. The most recent example, of course, being the tragedy in the hill country of Texas, the kind of flooding that now occurs quite often simply because warm air holds more water vapor than cold, loading the dice for increased flood events. So we're very much on a timetable to try and somehow limit the damage from climate change, which would require in fact, would require very fast change, very fast phase out of coal and gas and oil. The second piece of context is that phase out of coal and gas and oil is starting to happen quite dramatically in other parts of the world. We're now building renewable energy at a breakneck pace. I have a piece in the New Yorker yesterday that illustrates the fact that the planet as a whole is producing about a third more power from the sun this summer than it did last summer, and probably will be about the same increase next year. This work's being led by China, but it's also happening in parts of the US. California is using about 40% less natural gas this year to generate electricity than it did 2 years ago. That's an enormously helpful change if you're worried about climate, but it's an enormously dangerous change if you run an oil company. And because their profits depend on the constant expansion of their business selling gas and oil. And so they used their cash flow to help game our political system. You'll recall about a year ago when he was running for office, President Trump promised that if the fossil fuel industry gave him $1 billion, he would give them anything that wanted. They gave him about half that, but it turns out to have been enough because the big, beautiful bill is absolutely stuffed with provisions that are designed quite clearly to slow the transition to renewable energy. These include the cessation of the tax breaks for sun, wind, and batteries that were a big part of the Inflation Reduction Act passed in the Biden years. Those were supposed to last for a decade, but they will mostly phase out by the end of this year, some of them sooner. The tax credit for electric vehicles expires as early as the end of September. So those things will be extremely difficult for industries, renewable energy industries to deal with. The speculation now is that there'll be massive layoffs at the companies that do things like rooftop solar, and that lots and lots and lots of clean energy projects will be canceled. That's led to the to very angry statements from groups like the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, who see lots and lots of business disappearing in the years to come as there are fewer solar farms and wind turbines and things being built. Of course, that delay of the energy transition has other effects too. One will be to raise utility prices because we now live on a world where renewable energy is the cheapest form of energy. The cheapest way to make power on our planet is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. That's why it's expanded so rapidly in blue states as well as red. Texas actually is expanding renewable energy even faster than California at this point. And so the best estimate is that over the next decade, families will be paying hundreds of dollars a year more in electric bills than they would have had this not passed. And the second problem, along with climate, is that it delays the time when we stop putting so much pollution in the air. The combustion of coal and gas and oil obviously produce not just CO2, which harms the climate, but particulates which harm the human lungs. The estimate is that about 1 death in 5 on our planet comes from breathing the particulates and things that you get from fossil fuel combustion. In the US, there are hundreds of thousands of cases of childhood asthma, say, every year caused by this. And since we know who lives mostly near freeways and near power plants and things, we understand why this is a deep justice issue as well as a practical one. So it's a great paradox that just at the moment that the rest of the world is moving decisively in the direction of clean energy, the US is trying to move decisively against it. And in order to have any hope of countering that anytime soon, and we need to do it soon because climate change is happening so quickly, we need to rally public opinion in order to get what we can get done at least the state and local level. That's why many of us are coming together on a project we're calling not Earth Day, but Sun Day. That'll happen on the fall equinox, September 21st. You can get information at sunday.earth, EARTH, but it'll be a day of all kinds of festivities and protests, all designed to drive home the most important fact, which is that sun and wind are no longer alternative energy. They're the obvious, straightforward, common sense, and cheap way to produce power in this world. And we hope that people across many communities will be joining. We already have hundreds of events underway across the country for that day. I will add that the big, beautiful bill also, and this is sort of adding insult to injury, shuts down much of the funding for agencies like NASA and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that monitor the rise in temperature on this planet. We're literally turning off the satellites and pulling the plugs on some of the most important sensors and data, I guess, so that we won't notice that the temperature is rising on our planet. I doubt that that will be very effective because each of us, of course, have our own built-in internal sensors that help indicate to us that it's getting way too hot. But that's the plan, and that's where we are right now. To call all this a disgrace and a betrayal of America's scientific experience and leadership would be an understatement. So I'll stop there, and if there are any questions, I'll try to deal with them.
There are a number of questions, but I want to start out because we have you on. There were significant cuts to FEMA. Do you think that that contributed to the magnitude of the crisis that we are seeing in Texas right now?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, I mean, look, as far as I can tell, the FEMA director hasn't even bothered to show up in Texas yet.
He has not.
And around the country, everyone's in, every state and local official is now in a state of suspense about whether there'll be FEMA funding as disasters happen in the future. The Trump administration has said that they think states should pay for disasters instead of the federal government, but that's obviously silly. Though there are disasters every year in the United States, there's not disasters in every state every year. It makes no sense for each state to have its own, fully funded, fully prepared disaster corps. This is something we should do as a country. But I think that the most likely outcome, what seems to be happening, is that the president will dispense disaster aid henceforth as a political favor to people in groups and places that he favors, and not to places that he doesn't. Again, this sounds strange and un-American, but it seems to be the path that we're on right now.
Yeah. Linda Joy Fenley of Chico Soul has the first question. Linda Joy, please ask your question and welcome.
And thank you for inviting Bill. And Bill, thank you for participating. We really appreciate you being here. I represent a rural Northern California area hard hit by past wildfires, and we have rising summer temperatures, and we have occasionally poor air quality. How might the bills cut back on funding for forest management impact areas like ours?
Well, I'm afraid it will help deepen the spiral of trouble that you're already in. Among other things, the bill, the Trump administration has instructed national forests to greatly increase the timber cut on the national forests at the expense of all the other kind of planning and work that we should be doing, especially in an era of wildfires. One of the this will perhaps amuse you. 6 Republican Congress people yesterday sent a letter to the Canadian government complaining about smoke from wildfires in Canada blowing across the U.S. border and telling them to stop it. I don't know whether the Canadians have written back to say that the U.S. has produced the largest share of the greenhouse gases that are warming the planet and causing forests to catch on fire in places around the world. But this is another place, by the way, Linda Joy, where these questions overlap with the ones around Medicaid and rural hospitals and things, because, of course, climate disasters of all kinds, including wildfires, quickly become medical disasters as people need to go to the emergency room because they can't breathe. If that emergency room isn't there anymore, God knows where people will go.
Thank you.
Gabriel Young has a question. Gabriel, please ask your question.
Hi, Bill. Thank you so much for being here. You mentioned California benefits from using 40% less natural gas. And of course, in California, let alone Silicon Valley, EV companies such as Tesla, Lucid, and others innovate and provide livelihoods for a large API community here in California. But just the broad population general being the 4th largest economy. So how will the Big Beautiful Bill impact these EV companies and eventually all Californians and others who took advantage of the EV tax credits from the previous administration?
Well, if you have a tax credit from the previous administration, you're okay. And in fact, you can, and if you're at all interested, should buy an EV before the end of September because the tax credit will still be there. But clearly, this is all an effort to try and wreck the EV industry. And, you know, that's not going to happen, at least globally, because EVs are better cars. What we're really doing with this bill in the largest terms is ceding the economic and technological future to China, which is now going poised to be the biggest car builder in the planet. More than half the cars in China sold last year came with a plug. And companies like BYD are outperforming Tesla in many ways already, not to mention the big Detroit automakers. So I'm afraid that that will be the long-term effect here, that the economic gains will be transferred from our shores to Beijing.
Bill, I have a question for you. Given our audience here, could you just go further into the social justice impacts of this bill? You'd mentioned them briefly, but I wonder if you could elaborate.
Well, look, the most vulnerable communities in this country are the ones that are going to be hit hardest. The IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act funding for things like renewable energy was remarkable in that it was one of the first pieces of federal legislation ever to have really big efforts to push that funding in the direction of vulnerable communities. And there were big extra tax credits for people doing this in the places that needed it most. It'll now be hardest to do it in the places that need it most because they're by definition poorer, and it's harder to come up with the capital necessary to make these changes. That's what the fossil fuel industry wants, is for people to be stuck in the current paradigm and writing them a check for more oil or gas every month, instead of being able to take advantage of the fact that the sun is happy to deliver our energy for free every day when it rises above the horizon, as long as at some point you had the capital to put some solar panels on your roof. Putting those up has become much harder. If you're interested in doing it, move quickly, because the tax credits will expire at the end of the calendar year. There is some of this work that we can do at the state and local level, even in the absence of those subsidies. One of the reasons that solar energy is so much more expensive in America than it is in Australia or the EU is that we have a fairly Byzantine permitting system that requires going through a lot of local authorities. City halls and state legislators can streamline that and make it somewhat easier. But the effects of climate change, which is what they're going to unleash even more of with this bill, obviously fall hardest on the poorest communities. Every time there's a flood, we find out who gets to live in the river bottom. Every time there's a fire, we find out, who's most vulnerable and in particular, first-time home buyers and people who struggle with things like insurance payments are going to be particularly out of luck going forward, because those are rising dramatically as the climate begins to destabilize.
Yeah. Seema Gupta of the Silicon has a terrific question that I think all speakers could answer, and we'll end there. Seema, please ask your question.
So this is Amar.
Oh, hello.
On behalf of Seema. But the question is, what would be your message to the voters who created the situation for themselves? How can they correct it?
Thank you, Amar. Richard, why don't you take the first stab at Amar's question?
I apologize. My sound went out there just at the time it was asked. Can you ask it again, please? I apologize for that.
Yes, he asked, going slightly off topic, what would be your message to the voters who created this situation for themselves? How can they correct it?
So again, I'm gonna claim that that's a more of a political question than an economics question. And so I think that the evidence in the bill is pretty clear that it raised deficit. I think it's a lot of people, not just have shown that distributionally had some questions. So I think the only thing I could offer was that those people need to read those sources to get that. But I think the general question is more political than I'm willing to answer.
Okay, fair. Natasha, did you want to take a stab at it, or isn't it?
Yeah, she
I
might
can
have dropped off. I know that
I can
she
take a stab
dropped.
while Natasha's waiting, and I'm perfectly happy to be political. You better show up and vote on the next midterms. The polling indicates that there's a lot of people with buyer's remorse now and some of the polling is very encouraging, demonstrating new record support for immigration, say, in this country. But that only matters if people turn out. And really, long before those elections, we need people turning out in the streets and elsewhere. September 21st, the fall Equinox will be this Sun Day event, which is an effort to help people really rally around some of the environmental crises that we face. We've got a lot of work to do between now and the midterm elections.
And Larry, did you want to take a stab at Amar's question?
Yeah, I mean, this past election was not a healthcare election. Healthcare was not a prominent topic during the election. But this bill makes clear that the consequences of elections are big when it comes to the healthcare system. As I said, many elements of this bill don't take effect for many years. That both will be a challenge, I think, for Democrats who oppose the bill because there won't be a lot of tangible effects. But we have seen a number of midterm elections where there's been a backlash against healthcare changes. It was true of the Clinton Health Security Act back in the 1994 election, after the Affordable Care Act was passed, before the benefits took effect, and in 2018, after Republicans failed in their effort to repeal the Affordable Care Act. So I think there's a very good chance that we're going to see a similar backlash to this bill, including the changes coming to the healthcare system.
Well, speakers, thank you so much for joining us today for this extremely robust conversation. And reporters, thank you for all of your terrific questions. Next week, our briefing is scheduled for Monday, July 14th at 11 a.m. Pacific time in order to accommodate the schedule of our guest speaker, Senator Alex Padilla. So please join us on Monday at 11 o'clock. Thank you so much to all of you and have a terrific weekend.